To the last meeting of the Washington History Seminar. I want to begin by thanking Miriam Cunningham and Tim McDonnell for the logistical support that they give to the weekly meetings. And you will find already a schedule for the fall semester. We will reconvene on the 13th of September with Donald Ritchie, the historian of the Senate, and we will end in December with John Pocock of Johns Hopkins. Sonia is going to introduce our guests this afternoon, but we do have a ritual of everyone introducing themselves to the speaker. So I wonder if we could go around the table. And since this is our last meeting, perhaps say more than just a sentence about institutional affiliation. If, for example, Arnita Jones intends to establish a home for indigent Southern gentlemen, that type of thing would be very interesting to the rest of us. Holly, can we begin with you?
My name is Holly Daly. I do have an institutional affiliation with Georgetown University. Apart from that, I'm a bit of a loss. You caught me off guard.
Ken McDonald, former history professor, former historian at CIA.
I intend to join the institution there for the Southern Gentlemen, but I'm from the Department of State. And enjoy it. Thank you.
David Nichols, I'm at the Department of State. I spent some time at St. Anthony's where William Ledger Lewis is married.
Abdullah Sadiq from the American Historical Association, and I think that says it all.
I'm Joey Long from the Raja Ratnam School in Singapore, and currently here as a Fulbright Scholar at Wilson Center for Political Science.
I'm a program assistant with the History and Public Policy program, and I'm interested in 19th century European film.
I'm Dorothy Ross. I'm an American now at Johns Hopkins, and I've worked on it in a number of areas, but includes work is Freud's influence in Europe.
My name is Kathleen Friedel. I teach history at University of California at Berkeley, and I'm also a fellow here at the center, and I'm working on my project on the federal government's prosecution of the drug war, and I'm very honored to find myself in Lisa and sitting next to Dorothy Ross. So we're really nice surprise to meet.
I'm Steve Lagerfeld. I edit the Wilson Quarterly here.
Christian Osterman, I direct the European Studies program at the History and Public Policy program here at the Center. I champion the cause of history here at the Center, so I'm delighted that we've managed to put together such a wonderful series and ending on such an interesting note.
Roy Matthews, retired professor of history and humanities of Michigan State University.
I'm Katie Benton-Cohen. I'm assistant professor of history at Georgetown University and finishing up a year-long fellowship here. And I'm writing a book about something called the Dillingham Commission, which was the largest study of immigration ever conducted in the United States in the 1940s.
I'm Jan Lamberts. I work at the Research Center at the Holocaust Museum here in Washington, and I work on a book series, Jewish Perspectives on Persecution. So a labor of love, but more of a hate.
Very good. My name is Yang San Hong. I teach German history at State University of New York, and I've been a fellow here at the center.
I'm Arnita Jones. I am the soon-to-be retired executive director at the American Historical Association. So when I start coming to the seminars in the fall, I will be a consumer, and I'm very happy. I will not be running a home for indigent Southern gentlemen, however. I will be chilling out in Europe for the first couple of weeks of your seminars.
My name is Pranav Merchant. I'm a student at the University of Texas, Austin, and the University of Pennsylvania.
Pranav, I believe, is our first undergraduate to attend the seminar. I may be wrong. There may be others, but he's the first that I...
Maybe the top.
Yes.
My name is Elena. I was at the Research Center, and I studied the social implications of
Social implications of
new technologies.
new technology. Uh-huh.
My name is Sarah Friedman. I teach anthropology and gender studies at Indiana University, and I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center, and I work on marriage in the state and immigration in China and Taiwan.
You're Tom Conley. I'm an associate professor in the policy program. I'm Tim McDonald. I work at the Wilson Center.
I'm studying at a global history department, currently studying roles in the United States.
My name is Albert Beveridge. I'm superannuated graduate student in China.
I'm Tom Adams. I'm retired from NEH, and I'm working on social welfare development.
Devin Ferguson, a fellow here with the Wilson Center, teach at University of New York, Training College, U.S. Institute. My project here looks at consumer finance related to wealth management.
And I'm Miriam House, and I'm at the National History Center. Thank you all for coming for this first semester of this, and we look forward to seeing you all next semester starting on September 15th.
I'm Jill Shanklin. I would have been a historian, but after I finished my PhD on Irish history in Britain, there was no Irish history taught in UK universities. So I ended up working in the oil industry. I deal on the relationship between commerce and producers.
I'm Peter Bierstecker. I'm an intern here at the Wilson Center. Before these great weekly seminars, I got my history fix at Penn University.
Vladimir Rushnikov, associate professor at Tomsk State University in Russia, Siberia, and here is a Fulbright scholar at the Indiana Institute, and here because I'm historian, I love it. Very good.
Do you want to, ma'am, do you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Mary Woodbreaker, and I'm at the Muslim Scholarly Programs with the
Great. Well, as you can see, we have a very wide array of people here with lots of different interests from all over the world, and everybody is very eager to hear you. It's a great pleasure to introduce to you Louisa Passerini, who is someone whose name I knew, and I think that's probably true of many people before I ever had the chance to meet her, because she has done pioneering work in many subjects, initially in women's history and gender history. She's also been a path-breaking scholar in the field of oral history, and she's just done a great deal for so many people, not only in intellectually forging these fields, but also in supporting many, many people along the way. She began teaching at the University of Turin. She's also taught at the European University in Florence, and she's also taught in Australia and Germany and the United States. Well, currently she's helping to launch a program, or to sort of relaunch a program in oral history at Columbia University. It's an interdisciplinary program that sounds very, very interesting. It brings together historians and anthropologists and journalists and people in literary and cultural studies also. So it's a very robust approach to the whole field of oral history. And oral history is a methodology that has been central to Louisa in her many books. Among her books are Fascism and Popular Memory, The Cultural Experience of the Turin Working Class, which was published in 1987. These are the English titles of a lot of her books were initially published in Italian and then republished in English. The Autobiography of a Generation, Italy, 1968. Europe in Love, Love in Europe, Imagination and Politics in Britain Between the Wars. Memory and Totalitarianism, Gender and Memory. Women, and most recently, a number of recent books. One of them is Women, this is an edited book. She's also edited a number of books. This is Women Migrants from East to West, a collection that's based very much on oral histories and oral interviews.
This is The Dream, Sogno di Europa. It's a book of, in Italian, a compendium of many of the ideas that she's developed over the years, more for popular consumption. And most recently, Love and the Idea of Europe, which is what she's going to talk about today, which was also which was recently published by Berghahn Press and was published in Italy a couple of years ago. And we have flyers here for this book if you're interested in ordering it from Berghahn. So we'll pass these around. That's what she's going to talk about today. So please join me in welcoming Luisa Passerini. It's really a great pleasure to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. Many thanks, Sonia, and thanks, Roger, for the invitation. It is particularly welcome because I've finished, I think, this project on Europe and love, which has occupied much of the last 20 years. I just sent to the publisher a last book, an edited book, on the topic of Europe and love in the cinema. And so I think that with that, for a while, the topic will do without me. I think I helped to introduce it in the historical studies, but I also think that it can now go on its legs. So I think it's the right point for me to talk both about the general project that I engaged in 20 years ago and give some examples about this particular last book. I started with this project in 1992 at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, and then continued working on it at the European University in Florence, and then at the Kulturwissenschaftliches Institut in Essen. And I think that these institutions were crucial in shaping actually an idea of Europe and of European identity. This work, which I'm going to present, is historical, but I think it has repercussions in the way of understanding what European identity can be today. Can there be a European identity? And which is the importance of this topic, especially in view of the great changes that are affecting the continent, and not only the presence of the European Union and the risks which it is now facing, not existing any longer in the form it has been existing on, but also from the social and cultural point of view, the great wave of migration that is affecting Europe. Europe has gone very rapidly from being the major source of migration from to being the major recipient of migration into, and this is creating great problems. So who is a European? Who can a European be? And how do we envisage this problem historically? Seems to me relevant. So I will divide my talk into two parts. The first is about just to give an idea of the general projects on what I mean by Europe and love, and then more specific examples of historical research, because actually my method is largely microhistorical in the sense that I use a case study as a principal method. So largely because actually the question of emotion itself is to be posed, I think, in daily life, in the dimension of daily life, and in the dimension of the individual, the role of the individual in history. So that's why I will use the case study to a great deal. And the general project, it is started from a critical outlook on the view that Europeans had invented and had the exclusive monopoly of courtly and romantic love as the highest form of relations between men and women, an idea that had currency between the 1770s and the mid-20th century. It was in the last decades of the 18th century that courtly love started being seen as the cradle of European civilization and of the relationship between gender in Europe. This is, I will often try, knowing the kind of work you do in this center, to see some of the implications for the present of these historical remarks. So the debate about the origins of courtly love, whether it was Arabic or whether it was European, went on through the whole 19th century. And I think it has relevance for our discussions today about, for instance, Euro-Muslims. And so this whole myth started with the consideration of chivalry understood as a founding institution of European political and cultural civilization. A major contrast was established with classical antiquity, between classical antiquity and modern Europe. I'm talking, in fact, of the last decades of the 18th century and of the authors who, less known than the most well-known, the best-known philosopher, but authors who contributed to the encyclopédie, like the Chevalier de Jaucourt, who wrote the entry Europe, and Provençal poetry in the Encyclopédie of Diderot and D'Alembert, and Jean-Baptiste Lacune de Saint-Palais, who was actually the one who started collecting the poems of the troubadours. For him, as well as for his English equivalent, Thomas Warton, the modernity of Europe found its origins in Provençal love poetry, because it was, in fact, the cornerstone of the relationship between women and men, and because it expressed a new type of feelings between women and men that was derived from contexts between the south of Europe and the Celtic nations, Germans, Scandinavian, and Scythians, the Russians. So the idea was that Provençal culture was the beginning of modernity, of modern Europe, as far as feelings in particular were concerned, and as far as poetry being the center of culture. Now, this coupling of Europe and love went on in the 19th century. It was developed, for instance, I'm going very quickly, just for the sake of giving some background. It was developed by the members of the group de Copé around Madame de Staël, a group which in fact combined a liberal Europeanism, an idea of Europe and a united Europe in opposition to Napoleon, with a view of love and of the European nature of courtly love. There was, however, at this point, a rise of nationalist competition, which substituted the type of cosmopolitan understanding of these issues in the previous century. So, for instance, even in the case of the circle around Madame de Staël, there was a competition a tension between France and Germany, French and German scholars, about who had been the first to really understand the type of love which went under the name of courtly love, of fin amours, or minne, and so on. And in that development, through the whole 19th century, the debate on the possible Arabic derivation of Provençal poetry was dismissed very often, because it was unacceptable to think that such a cradle for Europe would come from the Orient. Now, what were the characteristics of the courtly love as understood in this century and in the 20th century? And why was it treated with an anti-historical approach, as if it evolved seamlessly into the feeling defined as romantic love, because among its characteristics were considered the insurmountable distance between the lovers and a destiny of unhappiness even in the case of reciprocated love. So the connection that later on Denis de Rougemont would have pointed out was between love and death, between the, even in the case of reciprocated love, the lack of possibility of having a happy ending for this love. This view was kept having being accepted until the 1960s. I'll come back to this, but I want to say first why the 1960s were a turning point. They were a turning point because in that period, romantic love came to be considered as a universal sentiment that can be found in all cultures of the world, although in forms and ways that vary enormously. So the exclusiveness of the connection between Europe and love was abandoned in the 1960s, sometimes going to the extreme of denying any specificity of Provençal love and poetry. This was partially due to the universalism of the 1960s, but more specifically to the revision of Eurocentric views in the field of Romance studies. For instance, Peter Dronk, in the mid-1960s, wrote that the feelings and conceptions of courtly love were universally possible at any time or place and at any level of society, which a type of and any level of society in popular as well as aristocratic love poetry. This type of criticism opened the way to a new understanding of these types of love in European civilization and, for instance, to a new vision of the role of women not only as inspirers and objects of love poetry, but as creators and performers of the love songs. It was only, however, the beginning of the 1990s that a German scholar, Angelika Rieger, published a corpus of poems by the Trobairitz. So the question whether women could be in full sense subjects of love discourses reappeared regularly in European culture, signaling one of the central contradictions between the formal and the substantial aspect of the recognition of women's equality in Europe. So the whole argument started with the claim at the end of the 18th century that courtly love had developed and was possible because a higher status of women was recognized in any other civilization. But throughout the 19th century, the role of women was mainly as objects, not as subjects. And the whole position in this history of the love discourse and history of the idea of Europe and their connections, the contradiction of the Enlightenment, one of the central contradictions of the Enlightenment was kept on between formal and substantial aspect of recognition of equality between genders. So it was formal but not substantial. This point we could discuss. And talking about the end of this type of Eurocentric conception, I should mention the position of feminists in the 1970s who criticized, feminist scholars, feminist theorists, criticized romantic love as the pivot of women's oppression, considering romanticism, this is a quote by Shulamit Firestone, a cultural tool of male power to keep women from knowing their condition. And the critique was that the false idealization of love concealed gender inferiority through the so-called pedestal treatment. For Germaine Greer, romantic love replaced parental coercion when the Protestant middle classes started abandoning arranged marriages in favor of free and equal unions. And in that sense, romantic love was a prelude to the establishment marriages of modern times. This criticism, however, never touched the question of the Eurocentric nature of romantic love and of the idea of romantic love. So feminist scholars did not challenge the Eurocentric paradigm. They challenged only the hierarchy between the genders. Now, all the issues involved in this approach, for instance, the connection between the public and the private spheres, this was a private type of love which was used, however, to represent European identity in the public field. The intercultural and intercontinental relationships, the relationship between gender and race culture, all these issues are of the utmost political relevance for Europe today, and especially for those that were previously unrecognized subjects of Europeanness, such as women, youth, and migrants. The privileged European subject for a long time was assumed to be white, Christian, and male. A historical understanding of these questions is therefore crucial to the cultural construction of a Europe which could be both aware of its depths to the world in the past and openly plural in the present. The intent of my project is therefore to criticize forms of Eurocentrism in the field of emotions, but at the same time to consider this history of this connection between Europe and love as a basis for a non-Eurocentric understanding of new possible European identities. The question of European identity has very often, I would say always, been defined as in contrast with another. The definition of Europeanness has always been accompanied by the definition of another which provided a contrast, and very often in the field of gender relationships. For instance, between European and Asian women, especially in the 19th century and early 20th century, considered respectively as free, the European, and as slaves, the Asian women, a contrast that was related to the attitudes towards love held by Christianity and Islam. And I mean, this stereotype is still present today, that there is no problem of emancipation any longer with European women, but there is still a problem with Asian women, particularly Muslim women. And this is particularly paradoxical, since the most recent scholarship has really established that all this heritage of courtly poetry, courtly love, and Provençal poetry is of Arabic derivation through Spain. But talking about the definition by contrast, the definition of identity through alterity, in the 20th century, the other of Europeanness in the field of love was established with the United States of America. It was now the contrast between the self, the European woman, and another which was notable for excessive freedom, almost license, and excessive freedom of American women, which brought to increasing rates of divorce in this country. Therefore, the USA represented the other, which would also be a possible future of Europe. And in all these cases, there was this double mechanism at work. On one hand, a definition of identity merely by contrast, projecting on the other the dark sides of the self, and on the other, using women and the images of women as the symbol for a whole civilization. And my understanding is that it is possible, on the basis of the new types of attitudes taken by many migrants in Europe today, that a definition of European identity can be given which is not in contrast of a superiority and exclusiveness towards other identities, but eventually complementarity and attraction between the self and the other. So I want to say, to make some brief remark about the sources I've used for the sake of historical research. I have used largely political essays, literary texts, but I have also used love correspondences, love letters, which are very difficult to find. I found some collections in the British Museum in London and in a archive for popular culture in Italy, and the type of letters that proved useful, the type of love letters which proved useful, were between couples of fiancés or married people, couples composed of two persons from two different nationalities. So, for instance, the correspondence at the British Museum was between an Anglo-Irish woman and a German count, and the one I've been working recently in this more recent book, between two Jewish persons, an Italian woman and a German man, because this difference in nationality obliged the couple to pose the question of their love relationship in a European perspective, in a more than national and more than binational perspective, particularly in the case of the Jewish couple, given the persecution by the Nazis and the effort to depure, so to say, Europe of any non-Aryan. These are some of the lines of the longue durée background for a research that, as I have said before, has chosen to focus on the micro dimension of the cultural processes that took place between the First World War and the 1940s in France and Italy. My first book on this topic was on Britain, which might have seemed a strange place to start for a research on love, but actually it was very useful because it helped in taking a distance between a distance and looking at continental Europe from a critical point of view. And this book, however, is on France and Italy, and it is composed of 6 case studies, and it is divided in 3 parts. One more justification: the choice of the period 1930s, 1940s is because of the crucial role that changes in the relationships between public and private had during that period. Not only, especially in the authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, which really switched the boundary between public and private, with the invasion of the private, for instance, with the rules on the demographic rules on fertility, but also in the democratic countries because of the changes induced by modernity in the field of gender relations and marriage. So the issue of gender is crucial, but so is the issue of the political regimes, authoritarian regimes during the interwar period. I would like to underline the fact that the Nazi propaganda appropriated the theme of Europe and love in a racist form. I just will quote a speech by Baldur von Schirach, who was the Reich Youth leader and Gauleiter of Vienna in 1942. He declared, this is the quotation from a speech of his, "The song that once filled the valleys of Provence and is to this day a triumphal song of Europe and of its civilization, the song of the troubadours as an expression of those higher feelings that distinguish us from the Jews and jazz-playing American Negroes, is something that people of Jewish mentality never can understand. Its whole ethos is foreign to the Jews." This is the idea, of the is the idea of the connection between Europe and love understood in a racist form. And in this historical context, therefore, I want to stress, it is a crucial point of my research, that the word Europe has a very wide range of meanings, from an association of federated states on the line of the 1930 proposal by the French Premier Aristide Briand to the League of Nations, to the idea of a united Europe under Nazism and fascism, to the cultural and moral union inspired by Giuseppe Mazzini, who fought for the unification of Italy in the 19th century, and also for the unification of Europe, which is less known. So these are just some of the ideas that compose the background of my research. Now I'll come to some more specific examples. First of all, I have studied two rather marginal individuals who were not very, who have been completely forgotten. One is, actually, I think that all this effort, my effort in finding aspects, ways of thinking about Europe that were then forgotten because they had a utopian nature, is of relevance, can become of relevance today, that Europe is at such risks that its the very idea of its union is again taking on utopian aspects. So I see a sort of recurrence of themes. Okay, I want to mention this Marquis and lawyer Giorgio Quartara, who lived in Italy between 1883 and 1951, and he was a feminist, a federalist, Europeanist and a federalist, and he was linked with Freemasonry. Freemasonry actually had an important role in envisaging a united Europe at the time, and he was in fact in favor of a federation of European states, the abolition of barriers and customs, and the putting together of the European colonies. So he was not an anti-colonialist. The idea of Europe very often went together with a position of a benevolent type of colonialism. He was linked to the Europeanist organization Pan-Europa, which was founded by Count Coudenove-Kalergi. And he wrote a dialogue entitled The United States of Europe and the World, a book that was banished by fascism and by the Vatican because it proposed the idea of free love and free sex in a free and united Europe. So he put together Bachofen, the original matriarchy, and the Federation of Europe. So love for him, so a federated Europe in the sense of Freemasonry, an economically united Europe, but also politically, and a type of free love based on free sex. And he also was he was part of the struggle against prostitution, and he represented feminist Italian feminists in some international conferences. together with him in the first part of my work, I consider another man, because I should say why. There is a first part of my book concerned with two Europeanist men. This other man was Leo Ferrero. He was the grandson of the sociologist and scientist Cesare Lombroso, who was the one who wrote, perhaps he's known mainly for his books on the role of women in the biological inferiority of women. He supported positivistically the biological inferiority of women. And this young grandson of his, on the contrary, developed an idea of a conjunction between love and Europe in a non-confessional religious syncretism, combining Christianity and Oriental religion. In all this story about Europe and love, the Orient has a major role. The Orient being the place where the concept of courtly love, of Provençal love came from, but also being the place where a type of different religious attitude could flourish, and especially in the 2 decades after the First World War, there was this sense that going to the Orient could be the way of finding new forms of spirituality for Europe. Now, Leo Ferrero is an interesting case because he believed that the relationship with the Orient and with Oriental religions would also be a way of freeing Western people, both particularly Europeans, but United States as well, from the burden of love. Love being a sort of condemnation, love being understood as the link to death and the link to despair. So there are interesting aspects, politically speaking, why Leo Ferrero is important. The fact that he translated into his time's languages the ideas of Mazzini, the nationalist freedom fighter for Italy, but also the anti-fascist Piero Gobetti and his followers, who were liberal Democrats. And therefore, all this contributed to the emergence of a European cultural identity that could be used to criticize the construction of a political, economic, and bureaucratic type of European Union. The fact that these two men are interesting are linkable together is due to their struggle against the concepts of masculinity in the cultural sense of what the subject of the love discourse could be at the time, in the sense that, as I said before, traditionally the subject of the love discourse in this European context was considered to be male. And the character of masculinity was unavoidable from the very concepts of Europe and of the subject. On the contrary, these two elaborated a sort of feminist perspective, as far as was possible for them during that period, taking sides with women, taking sides with feminists, trying to be active in the cause of suffrage, for instance. So they are linked by the fact that at the same time, the effort to be Europeanist, to be feminist, to be federalist, and to deal with love were all present in in two different constellations, one being materialistic and the other being sort of spiritualistic. So they are linked by this. And they also were marginalized by the fact they were anti-fascists. So they couldn't find they couldn't be published in Italy, or they were, and then their writings were banned. And both of them found a refuge in France, and Leo Ferrero later on in the United States. So France becomes actually the natural point of reference for anti-fascists and for particularly anti-fascist Europeanists in this period. France representing somehow still the universalism and the universalist idea of Europe from the Enlightenment. So another part of my work has been on two case studies, Francophone case studies. One is a group of intellectuals around a journal called Cahiers du Sud, which was based in Marseille, starting in 1926 and continuing through the 1950s. This group which is an interesting case, one of the few cases of such an important group of intellectuals developing in France out of Paris, in the south. And however, well, for instance, some of the contributors to the Cahiers were Paul Valéry and Jean Ballard, but also Simone Weil, and also Walter Benjamin when he was running away from the persecution of the Nazis. And the interesting contribution by the Cahiers du Sud to the idea of European love was that, first of all, the journal always believed and put forward the idea that Europe had been born out of Provence, and therefore not out of France, but out of Provence, from the south, and from a type of civilization that owed a lot to the Arabs. So the Cahiers developed a view of the Mediterranean which was decidedly anti-fascist. Of course, Mussolini and the fascists had an idea of the Mediterranean as, they said, Mare Nostrum, our sea, the sea which had started with the Romans and belonged to the fascist empire. And to this idea, the Cahiers du Sud opposed an idea of the Mediterranean as a place of encounter between the Arabic and the European cultures, between actually all the cultures of the Mediterranean, in a type of Mediterranean Europe. They developed the idea of a Mediterranean Europe which has a liquid base, the sea that allows in a continuous exchange between the Middle East, Northern Africa, and Southern Europe. Again, I think this is an interesting type of idea which has been picked up by scholars like Ian Chambers recently as a way of correcting the northern Eurocentrism of Europe and enlarging. Well, you might remember that Morocco applied for a membership in the European Union, and it was denied it because it was considered not to be Europe. So this idea challenges the territorialization of Europe and deterritorializes it in a way that is also relevant for the case of Turkey, for instance. You know, the Mediterranean gives a different basis for identity. A very important contribution to the Cahiers was done by Simone Weil, in fact, who wrote 2 articles on Provençal love in the Cahiers, maintaining that the Provençal culture had been. She made a comparison between the massacre of the Albigensian massacres, when the Catholic Church had sent the crusade against the Catars, and a crusade that physically destroyed the Provençal culture. Simone Weil made a comparison between that historical event and the threat by the Nazi to Europe. A similar threat, which was a threat not only to the material aspects of civilization, but to the very language, for instance, the language of poetry, the language of culture. And she was seeing the Nazi danger as a danger for the very spirituality of Europe. And so she was, I think that, again, very interesting, important resonance for us today are her remarks in this context on the spiritual type of totalitarianism, intellectual type of totalitarianism that can arise in certain periods, and the fact that an intellectual duty is to fight against that. Also linked with the cahier, but of a more relevance is independent of this, is Denis de Rougemont, who wrote his famous book Love in the Western World. I have already hinted at his idea. This book, which first came out in 1939 and then was republished twice with revisions in 56 and 72, has been a bestseller for many decades in Europe and in the world, and it does support the idea that there is a uniqueness of love in Europe, but it is of the way in which love is understood in Europe, but it is linked with the Orient, in the sense that the origin. Now, to say it as briefly as possible, de Rougemont distinguishes between two types of love. One love which leads to fusion between the lovers, or fusion between the human being and God, so either mystical. And there is another love which keeps the difference and the distance between the two. The fascination of the Europeans with courtly and romantic love is the fact that they are both linked with death, and therefore they are linked with a fusion, which is the end of the two individuals. And this comes from a badly understood. Am I going to?
We want to make sure we have time for questions.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So the origin of this type of fascination for death and love connected with death is really a misunderstood heritage from the Orient, from the Oriental mystique of the fusion between human beings and God. The last part I will not have time to elaborate on, but I will just mention, and I think it's good to finish with that, this love correspondence between the German medical doctor and an Italian woman. They wrote to each other at the end of the 1930s, and then they had to leave Italy, where he had found refuge after fleeing from the University of Berlin, because of the racial laws in 1938. And they maintained in this correspondence a strong claim that they were Europeans, in spite of the fact that they were being thrown out of Europe precisely on the assumption of a new type of purified Europe. They went to Bolivia, and they worked with the native populations there, and they stayed there for 6 years. They went back to Europe in 1947, And in their letters, I have many quotations of the way they talk about Mother Europe as a type of heritage that is undistinguishable from their being Jewish, being European, and being able of being such, even when in exile. So I was particularly moved by this claim to be European on the part of people who are denied their Europeanness in connection with some of the issues I was mentioning at the beginning of this talk, in the sense of wondering if, there is no European citizenship as such. One cannot get a European citizenship unless one has a national citizenship. So one has first to be a German or an Italian or a French, and then one becomes, through that, is a European citizen. To have an Italian citizenship takes 10 years. So I am wondering, for the people who today are denied citizenship, are denied Europeanness, is it possible that any of them has a similar attitude to the one I was describing, that a claim to be European that is not accepted today? And I hope that works like this can contribute to understanding of this sort of things. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, comments? Kathleen? Oh, yeah. Yeah, right.
Louisa, my parents are Czech. I grew up the daughter of immigrants who left their country after 1968. And so I grew up as an amateur oral historian, and a bad one. And I've noticed that the parent-child relationship is kind of a particularly fraught relationship from which to extract, oral histories and so forth. So by the time I was allowed to go back to what was then the Czech Republic, I was quite excited to meet my grandparents, because I was then already a graduate student and had worked with veterans' history collections that were often, interestingly, addressed to the grandchild. At that point, someone is ready to tell their story in a less kind of emotionally fraught way. And I was really surprised to discover that my grandparents were kind of equally closed, including very reluctant to talk about the stories of how they met. And so their own love stories, their own courtships. And as it turns out, my father's side, my grandparents, I learned later and from other sources that she is Polish, which is kind of an internal other in Czechoslovakia. And then on my mother's side, both of my grandparents are assimilated Jews, which of course is a great other internally. And so in hearing your tale about how the narrative of courtship is read against the narrative of a European identity, I couldn't help but think about my grandparents and how marriages and the actual, affecting of a love union is made possible or not at the level of the nation state, and the uneasiness and the others built into the nation state kind of forms limits around love and courtship. So just to press you a little bit on the point that you were making just at the very end, which is, if part of your political mission is to create some cultural plurality around the idea of love, doesn't that necessarily involve creating some tolerance made manifest at the level of nation state? Because after all, these are the practical ways in which these things are facilitated. Thanks.
Can I reply?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yes, actually, you pose more than one question, I think, because, first of all, certainly it is a question at a national level, but it is also a European question. I mean, today the situation is such that some of the rules concerning so-called mixed marriages change from one country to the other. So if you move, if you are a foreign person and you want to marry in France is different. The rules are different than they are in Italy. So there is no European level. And some of these rules are, for instance, in the Netherlands, it's very interesting that, and worrying, that there is a lot of suspicion towards the so-called fake marriages. And fake marriages can be considered such mainly when the two persons involved are not citizens of the same country. And then in that case, they are called to present proofs that they are in love, which is rather extraordinary. So they have to bring love letters from their parents, stating that it is a serious relationship, and so on. So there is a form of discrimination based on this idea of love, which is, however, it's not at all called into question when two Dutch persons are involved. So I think that certainly there is a lot to do on the national grounds, and Italy has a lot to do. Because, in fact, 10 years for citizenship is, and the present laws are worse and worse. There are laws that make it, a recent law made it a crime, as it is, a similar law here, a crime to be a clandestine immigrant, so that it's not only, it's actually criminal offense. And there are also regulations which are being passed at the government level. For instance, regulations in schools that say that no class can have more than 30% of children of foreign born, which, all these are. So there is a lot to do in this sense towards migrants, but I would say that the European level is also very important, because sometimes it could act as propelling the national level on the juridical for what concerns the laws. And I think that, for instance, also the European Court has been having a very useful role with some decisions that establish the rights of citizens of, for instance, of Britain, and which were not recognized in Britain itself. So this, and actually the question of the so-called mixed marriages can be faced only at an international level, if people move around. Because migrants very often, the whole question of European citizenship, I think, also arises in relationship to migration, because migrants often disperse. One member of the family is in Germany, one member is in Italy, one member is in France, and so it's not enough for them to get a national citizenship. They would need a kind of multiple citizenship, and which is connected with the question of marriage and love and so on.
Professor Dorothy Ross.
Well, I had a couple questions. One, you say in the 1960s, romantic love began to be understood as a universal sentiment. I wondered who is it that is beginning to make that claim? Is it coming out of anthropology, particularly, or certain kinds of left intellectuals? And I could wait with the second question if you
Okay,
may.
so I was referring particularly to Romance philology and to some of the works published in that field. For instance, I mentioned Peter Dronke, D-R-O-N-K-E. He has a crucial book published, I think, in 1966 on this really deconstructing the idea of the Europeanness of courtly love. Later on, it would be anthropology.
Yeah.
Yeah. For instance, I just out of my mind. One collection of essays by Jankovic, Jankoviac. Same idea. There is, but not, idea in the ethnographic sense, meaning in all cultures there is this sentiment. And the only, the only difference, however, is which role does a culture attribute to this sentiment? Is this type of emotion given a central role in the representation of identity or not? And also the relationship with marriage, of course.
Yeah. The other question I had is about, there is a very strong kind of stream of thinking coming out of modernism that is anti-romantic love. And when I think of some of Freud's work, which is interpreted as debunking romantic love, finding infantile origins of romantic love, isn't that a powerful strain of modern thinking when you come to the mid-20th century that would certainly work against the kinds of traditions you're talking about?
Against the claim of the Europeanness?
Yeah, right.
Well, I wouldn't say so, because in historical terms, it doesn't change the historical terms. I would think that still it would imply a change in attitude, but not for the future, but not for the past. Would you? I mean, would
well,
you see? Where would you see the implications of this type of anti-romantic in this field, in this particular field of?
Well, it's a kind of it would lead to a kind of it seems to me a kind of cosmopolitanism, universalistic cosmopolitanism. Freud is universalistic. This would so that it's a well, I see what you're saying. It doesn't necessarily
going backward as well as forward.
Yeah.
I mean, just in the way that in the Enlightenment or science, sort of, looks back and says, well, these were myths. These were these were delusions. This was.
Yeah, but where would you see the actual repercussions of this? I see them in the 1960s, but before then maybe I haven't seen it. I don't know. Maybe you see them. Where are the repercussions of this in the way of connecting?
Well, maybe like readings of Flaubert, readings of Tolstoy. I mean, readings of novels where romance leads to tragedy, that sort of thing.
But it always leads to tragedy.
Yeah, that's true. Right. Well, that's true. That's true.
I don't know, but for instance, I think of films. For instance, just not to think only of literature. In films, this stereotype of the impossibility of love between a European and a non-European is almost everywhere. Unless after the 1950s, but before then, it's always unhappy because it's not, especially between a European woman and non-European man. Yes, you would.
Just in light of that, it occurred to me that one of the earliest examples of that kind of tragic romance is of Othello wooing Desdemona. And what struck me as you were talking about the entire problem in the longue durée is that it's interesting that Othello woos Desdemona using the stories of anthropophagi, the cannibals, the othering, which to me it seems like a very brilliant exposition of the construction of Europeanness in this transnational, transracial, transreligious romance. which is then at the same time as it is ending in tragedy, is also helping Europeans in England, but perhaps elsewhere too, to begin to see this, this whole connection between stories of cannibals, colonial people, which Othello uses to woo Desdemona. So, I mean, it's
That's
just a comment.
Very interesting, in fact.
So,
yeah. I mean, there are strong connections with this, the whole idea of colonialism and imperialism in all this, as in fact the exploitation of this type of is one of the pillars of.
No, it just seemed to me interesting that the otherness of the non-European is emphasized in this very, very action of an transnational romance. But I also was wondering about the connections between romantic love of the modern period and the whole question of private property and marriage, which, I mean, you didn't talk about it, but I'm sure it's behind in your arguments.
What was your point?
No, that I mean, shouldn't we see that as one of the reasons for the rise of heterosexual romance, in fact, in particular, as underlining the whole question of development of private property? I mean, I'm obviously referring to Engels and the Marxist argument there, but in other words, I mean that romance is not just eros in the old-fashioned or courtly love, but it's connected to the development of a modern economy.
Oh, that's right. One of the reasons why this whole story that I've been trying to present is a myth is that precisely because it detaches the discourse on love from the discourse on marriage and property. It actually, sometimes it opposes them, but not in the case of the Rougemont. Because he has these two conceptions of love. Yeah. Should I go into that or have more questions? Or?
Well, no. I wanted to sort of come back to something that you said before, which is that the way, I mean, what we've been talking about are the ways that national identity interrupts or threatens the possibility of romantic love, but romantic love also trumps nationalism. I mean, one of the roots to national citizenship is marriage, like war brides or, I mean, family unification, so a lot of immigration law privileges love in a way. And it says if, people love each other, the fruits of that, either marriage and or children, allows them to jump the line, to have access to citizenship, to national citizenship ahead of other people. Family unification, in current immigration law, at least in the U.S., and I think this is probably true in a lot of Europe too, family reunification has higher priority for citizenship than economic arguments, for example.
Yeah, but this is a different topic than the one of the person, the immigrant marrying somebody local.
Yeah.
So this is the family reunification implying same culture.
Right, that's true. But still, but a man, it's not, and it's often a man. Until recently, it's always been the man who could.
It's also the women.
The women too, but before that, at least in the U.S., it was men who could bring in their brides from another culture, and they had that privilege. So in a way, love allowed them to sort of jump the queue.
Mm-hmm. No, but what my argument was mainly in terms of the fact that this type of love and marriage, when it is based on that type of love, is made very difficult for interracial, for people of different races. That's and the nationalities the different nationalities in certain periods of time had also an element of opposition. But it was during the late 1930s, it was certainly the case for the couple which was composed of a German and an Anglo-Irish.
Right.
That was certainly the case.
Yeah.
It was an opposition. And for the case of the two Jewish persons, it was the fact that they were in fact Jewish. But the examples from the present are linked to the fact that the problems seem to rise particularly with people of different races. And so, in the case of the migrants, I was thinking of certain situations in which a migrant had married in France and then had certain rights in France that she didn't have in Italy, and so on. That's why the national level would not seem enough.
Right. Roger, I was thinking about in the colonial situation where colonial, white colonials, for example, would have relationships with indigenous people, but though it was hard in many colonies that was not possible to sanction those with marriage, so that women would become concubines and that sort of thing. So the conception, I think that this reinforces Louise's point that it was possible to conceive of marriage between people of the same race, but not between people of different races. So they had to have a different kind of relationship.
Well, as Louisa was pointing out, it does change over time. For example, from the 18th century and in the 19th century, virtually marriage would become much more difficult than previously. And then it became possible after the Second World War to have what were called mixed marriages, and it did give them the advantage of citizenship, as it does in this country. Americans marrying someone in Africa, the wife receives American citizenship.
Right.
Well, in the case of colonialism, for instance, with the racial laws in Italy, we usually quote them with reference to the Jews, but they had an important resonance in East Africa, because there it meant that Italian men could no longer marry African women, and they could live with them, right? They could live with them.
Right.
And there is a whole phenomenon which is called madama, because these women were concubines and they had children, but it was a criminal offense for the Italian law to live with these women. So if they were caught, they would be put in camps, the men.
Yes.
In your studies, have you found a correlation or connection between advances in science and biology, say Darwin, and as far as Crick with DNA, and how love has been perceived differently, how its perceptions have evolved?
I am afraid I have not worked on that, but the only link I can see is the complete change in perspective from works such as the one by Lombroso, the positivist type of scientist, and the way they conceived love. But I wouldn't be able to say anything more meaningful after that.
Did you have an idea? Was there something that had occurred to you? No.
I'm just wondering how, specifically in regards to women and non-European people and their genetic ability. I guess people think they're not able to, but with maybe Darwin's theory, people would think that that concepts of romantic love are universal. They're more biologically based and not culturally based. That's something along the lines of what I was thinking.
Yes.
Yes, Ambassador.
In your research, did you find that many European countries had laws against marriages between people of different races, as was practiced in the United States, for example? You just alluded to the Italian example.
The laws the laws, for what I know, open explicit laws were only during the fascist and Nazi period. The other laws I was talking about were not laws against, the ones, for instance, in the Netherlands are not law against marriage between mixed couples, but they are against the so-called fake marriages. And so it so happens that these fake marriages, so-called fake marriages, are often between people of different races, but there is not any mention of the race in any law.
Yes, Jill.
I'm just thinking of sources, and I'm wondering, when did magazines start having advice columns on love and marriage? And what do those tell us about changing ideas, underlying concepts?
Well, first of all, I think they certainly started. I have seen them in the interwar period. They exist for the interwar period. They might have existed earlier. I am not. I mean, I have studied the 20th century. And what do they tell? Unfortunately, I'm not sure they tell very much, because we don't have any. Most of the times, we don't have any proof that these were actual letters. They tell us something about the norms, but not the behaviors. It's completely different from the private letters.
I mean, because advice columnists were writing their own letters and then answering them.
Yes, so they give you. It's like like studying good manners, a handbook of good manners. They tell you what you're supposed to do. It's not necessarily what you do.
Or that's true.
Could I ask you about arranged marriages and how they fit into the general notion of love? It would seem to give point to Sudir's comment that love is integral to a modern economy.
Well, I just read a book by Rochona Majumdar, actually, about arranged marriages in India, and she completely reverses our usual opposition, the usual opposition between arranged marriages and love. She refers particularly to India, but she shows how under the title of arranged marriages there is such a multiplicity of feelings that it also includes love, and that that is very interesting, because she argues that this is part of the more general argument about multiple modernities. So she argues that you cannot use the idea of arranged marriage against the idea of love as a sign of non-modernity against modernity. Modernity can well go together with arranged marriage.
Interesting.
That's the assumption.
We're coming to the close of our seminar session. Could we ask for a last question or so? Yes.
Counterexample to courtly love for the Europes, and I'm thinking of the harem as representing Oriental despotism and so on. And I wonder if you would have any thoughts, particularly on that wonderfully complex example of Montesquieu's Persian letters, where the revolt in the harem overthrows despotism, but at the same time the Persian visitors are criticizing Europe. I mean, it's a very involved, but it sets the harem against Europe as an example of despotism.
But do you think this is a counterexample? Because it seems to me to go in the same direction of in fact counterposing the possible freedom of women with women as slaves, and so that at the same end of the spectrum are on the one side despotism and the oppression of women, and on the other freedom and the equality of the genders. But the only problem is that on the side of freedom and equality and democracy, all these are not substantially recognized. No, substantially recognized. They are only formally recognized. That seems to me the main problem if we talk about Enlightenment, the heritage of the Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And that is the reason of the criticism that has come from various parts towards the so-called, the claimed universalism of the Enlightenment, I think.
Professor Passerini, we want to thank you for a most